We're just going to give people a few more minutes to log on here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Also, just to note, questions are open. So if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the questions chat, and we will cover them after the presentation. Again, we'll just wait another 2 or 3 minutes for people to log on, and then we'll get going. Thanks for your patience. All right, we'll go ahead and get started in 1 minute here. For those that just joined, I'll just repeat, if you have questions, go ahead and use the question section to ask those. We'll cover those at the end of the presentation. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. I apologize if there's any background noise. It's a little bit noisy here in my apartment, but we'll do the best we can. Today I'm going to be covering a phenomena that I have seen over the years, consulting for various companies in different roles, DevOps type roles, management type roles. It's been a recurring theme throughout my career. And I never really had a name for it, but I've come to call it the DevOps speed bump. And when explaining it to other people in the DevOps or similar industries, that seems to resonate. It's something that a lot of people I've talked to have recognized. And so today I'm going to be covering kind of what that is. What is the speed bump? How can you recognize if you've hit the DevOps speed bump? What that looks like, how to identify it. And then more importantly, how do you get past it? If you do identify that you have hit a speed bump, how do you get past it in a DevOps context? And then more importantly, can you prevent the speed bump? Can you actually prevent ever hitting it in the first place? So we're going to cover those three things and then open it up for a few questions. The total time here should be around 20 to 30 minutes with the questions at the end, depending on how many questions there are. So let's go ahead and jump into first talking a little bit about the promise of DevOps versus what sometimes happens in reality. So everybody that adopts DevOps does it in the hopes of seeing increases in efficiency, in speed of development, or just general speed across the company, across processes, and better communication. These are all things that DevOps can do for us, that DevOps promises to us if it's adopted. Now, as anyone who's actually done DevOps in the real world knows, sometimes the reality doesn't quite match up to those expectations or those promises. What we see quite often in a DevOps context is things are overpromised, or the amount of effort required to accomplish something isn't really accurately estimated in advance. And so you end up with some disappointments along the way in some cases. And sometimes it's just due to, sort of broken process or, lack of tooling or skills or those kind of things. But the other source of disappointment that I've seen is this DevOps speed bump that I've talked about, where the implementation is actually going fairly well within a company if they're doing some kind of DevOps transformation or changing over their tooling to be more automated and trying to implement more of a DevOps culture. Sometimes fundamentally, there's nothing really wrong with what they're doing, but the actual execution of it is not as clean as it could be. And that's where we tend to see the DevOps speed bump. So even if you're following all the best practices, you're using the right tooling and those kind of things, you can still run into this. And it's something that happens across very high performing organizations, in my experience, as well as lower performing organizations. So it's certainly nothing to be ashamed of. If you do find yourself running into the speed bump, it's something that happens to all types of organizations, in my experience. And it is something that can be dealt with effectively and something that can be prevented in the future. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. When you're looking at a slowdown in DevOps automation process, or your expectations are not really being met when it comes to a DevOps transformation, you want to look at kind of what the root causes could be. If you've identified that you are using sort of DevOps methodologies and tooling and things like that are correct and still not seeing the results you want. Quite often what I see, probably the number one cause of the DevOps speed bump is this organizational resistance to change. And this is something I've written about before. It's something that I see quite often, particularly in large organizations. But it really tends to be difficult to identify because it's very passive. It's not an active blocker of anything. It doesn't cause any immediate sort of obvious resistance to a DevOps rollout or a tooling rollout or a change in process. But it's just sort of a passive lack of forward progress in certain things or a lack of change. And that's something that can be effectively dealt with. It's a little bit trickier, probably the hardest one to change because it is a culture issue within organizations. It can be very difficult, particularly if you're not in a management position or a position to really drive change from the top of the organization. But it can definitely be done by offering better alternatives and sort of leading the way by example. The second root cause of DevOps slowdowns, or a DevOps speed bump, as I call it, is, in my experience, is immature or broken automation. And this is actually more common in startups, but it happens in more mature organizations as well. Basically, what you see here is some kind of automation is rolled out, probably with big promises, and then it just doesn't perform the way that it's supposed to. And this is often, tools will get a bad rap when something's broken. People tend to blame the tools. Quite often, it's just the execution or the way that it's set up or configured, or it's just immature. So we'll get into kind of how to handle that sort of immature, broken automation later, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you've recently rolled out some sort of automation in your organization, or you've tried to automate some kind of process or implemented some tooling that does some kind of automation. This is not uncommon. It's it's certainly not something that you are going to be blocked forever on. It's something that can be worked on and overcome if you treat your automation like a piece of software. Where there are bugs, the bugs need to be fixed. It can be immature when it's sort of in beta, when you first roll it out to your organization. And this applies sort of regardless of the type of tooling that you're using or those kind of things. So that's something to keep in mind that we'll cover in a few minutes here. The first thing to consider when you're looking at, you've identified that you have hit a speed bump in your DevOps implementation, and you're looking at how you can get past it, is to evaluate process. And this is actually in the opposite order of the previous slide. So we're going to be talking first about the obvious fixes, and then we'll get into the culture and communication aspects, because those are a little bit more complex. And I find that it's better to cover the process tooling and software side of things. So the first thing to look at when you're trying to get past this sort of slowdown or speed bump is your processes. And this is really difficult to do objectively. When you're in the day-to-day of different processes and different pieces of software, tooling that are being rolled out and those kind of things, really getting an objective evaluation of the process is super difficult. And this is where, sometimes bringing in someone from the outside can help, or hiring someone who can really work on that, depending on the size of your organization, can be quite useful. But really what you have to try to do is put yourself outside the process, look at how it fits in with the rest of the processes within your organization. Try to get that sort of 10,000 foot level view of the processes, rather than being inside the process, where sometimes things seem like they're necessary or a process seems like it has to be a certain way. Quite often, it's not really the case, or the process could be done away with altogether or rolled into another process. So really look at which processes are a bottleneck for productivity. That's often the easiest sort of quick win that you can get when you're doing this DevOps rollout. Like, why are things not moving forward as fast as they should be? And then figure out where the bottleneck is in process, and then look at how you can Not necessarily eliminate that bottleneck because it may be necessary, but how can you streamline it? How can you make sure that it's not a bottleneck anymore? Because bottlenecks are quite often not really bad per se. They're just not set up and designed to be streamlined from the get-go. The second thing to look at is the broken automation or immature automation tooling that I covered briefly on the previous slide. You're really going to want to go through the process and the tooling and the automation that you have in place and look at which parts you're spending time fixing or which parts are taking attention away from sort of pure development and work on other areas of the organization or your pipelines and those kind of things. Quite often this will be like build pipelines in a CI server, or it'll be a code review process that is partially automated that causes issues. Deployments are a huge source of sort of broken automation woes, where broken deployments take up team time. Every time you have sort of automation that breaks, you end up with a situation where you're wasting, quite often hours or days of a team's time, not only for them to wait on the automation to be fixed, but you're also wasting the time of the people that are looking at the automation and trying to fix it. And this is not necessarily a bad thing if you've just rolled out automation recently. Having some issues with it is normal, but you really need to treat it like it's a piece of software and develop it accordingly. So think about your automation like a new application that's still in beta or something along those lines, and then treat it like that, where you're rolling it out slowly, you're testing it piece by piece, and you're expecting that there will be issues. Too often people kind of implement an automation process of some kind and they just sort of throw it over the wall and say, okay, it's done. That's almost never really the case in my experience. When you roll out a piece of DevOps automation, whether it's a CI pipeline or a deployment process, or a code review process or testing, all of those things require maintenance, and they are quite often rolled out in a beta state that's not really working 100%. So one of the keys to getting past the speed bump is recognizing that, okay, this automation that we put in place may not actually be finished yet, and we need to develop it like we would any other kind of application. Treat it kind of like an internal tool. Work on it, iterate on it, identify the issues with it, and then work on fixing those. If you're a DevOps team in a larger organization, make sure you have a way to receive feedback from the teams that are actually using your tools and using your automation. Track those things just like you would, or like a development team would track like external bug tickets from customers. Treat the other teams in the organization as your customers. If you're working on more of a startup sort of context, that can be a little bit more fluid, but you'll still want to make sure that you have some way of receiving feedback if you're embedded in a team from your colleagues or team members when they identify issues with the automation, because quite often you may not see them. If you already knew that something was an issue, you probably would have fixed it before you rolled the automation out. So what you want to do is make sure that you're able to receive feedback from others when they identify issues with the automation, and then you can start to fix it. The final thing to look at is whether your tooling is really the right tooling. This is a little bit less common in my experience, which might surprise some people. But generally, I find that tooling, if you're using normal sort of accepted tools in the DevOps world, the ones that catch on and gain rather wide adoption generally do what they need to do, and there's usually a pretty good sense in the community of sort of what different tools do well and how they do it. So I see tooling being blamed a lot in many cases for DevOps failures or slowdowns when companies hit the DevOps speed bump. But in my experience, it's usually actually the use of the tooling, and again, this sort of expectation that, okay, we're going to put this tool out there and everything's going to be fixed and it's just going to work, when in reality, it needs to be continuously worked on and continuously improved. So you do want to look at your tooling, evaluate whether you're using the right tools for the job, but try to avoid the tendency to blame the tooling for your issues. This is super important. Too many teams that I see roll out some new tooling, it doesn't quite work the way they want, and rather than spend a little bit of time fixing it and helping to bring their automation tooling to maturity, they abandon it and move on to a new tool. And then I see this happen in cycles over and over, where a tool gets abandoned, a new one gets rolled out, it doesn't really do what's needed, or it gets too complex, or it's broken or not mature enough, or the implementation of it, probably more precisely, is not mature enough. And then it gets abandoned eventually, or the person responsible for it leaves and someone else comes in and changes to another tool. So this is particularly important for managers. If you're evaluating the tooling that you're using, make sure that it is the right tooling for you, and you will want to look into that and ensure that it's the correct tooling. But make sure you're not flip-flopping between tools too much as well. Once you've identified that tool set that can do the job for you, give it some time, stick with it, and treat it as a improvement and immaturity of automation problem instead of just a tool problem, if the tool can actually do what you need. And this requires some level of objectivity. It's not easy, but it is necessary if you want to kind of grow past the scenario where you're switching between tools all the time, like I mentioned. And then this kind of loops back to your process. Is your process working with the tools that you're trying to use? So you can almost think of this step one here as kind of being circular, where you're evaluating your process, you're fixing any immature or broken automation, you are evaluating the tooling that you're using, and then going back to your process and making sure your process is aligned with your tooling. So think of this as like the continuous improvement cycle, or a feedback loop, where you can kind of go through these steps, go back to the evaluation of the processes, and then move back through your automation, your tooling, and do that a few times for a few iterations, and you'll end up in a really good place where your processes are aligned, your automation is mature and it's working, and the tools that you're using are the right tools for the job. I find 2 or 3 cycles of that within any given team over a couple months, and you'll have a really, really good set of processes and set of automation and set of tools that works for your team. And that's kind of how you really implement a DevOps transformation within a given team or within a given company, and do it the right way, where you're not totally glued to any specific process or tool in the beginning. You leave yourself some flexibility, but you also have a sense of what tools can do the job for you, and when it's just an issue of needing to fix or mature your automation versus swapping out tooling and things like that. And that process, if you go through that cycle, gives you the ability to do all of those things in a way that won't leave you constantly sort of flip-flopping forever between different tools and different processes. This moves us on to step 2 of getting past the speed bump. I left this one for last because it's a little bit harder to quantify. But doing an objective analysis of your company's culture and the way that you communicate can quite often get you past the speed bump as well. There's sort of a part of this that loops back to the previous mention of getting feedback on your automation from your customers, which are typically your developers or your developer teams, if you're in a larger company with multiple development teams. But really looking at your communication and then the culture of the company. Is the company afraid of change? And then figuring out what the core issues are. Is it a communication issue? Is it a culture issue? Is it that sort of passive resistance I mentioned earlier to any kind of change within your culture, which is particularly common, I think, with larger companies, but it happens in startups as well. If you're a manager, then this is a little bit easier to do, because you can start to kind of dictate at least the way that your team communicates. And I don't like to use the word dictate, because typically dictates don't last very long if you have kind of top-down commands for teams. But if you can show them the way, that's better. So you can sort of work on your communication if you're a manager. If you're not, and you're more of a individual contributor or DevOps engineer, it can be a little bit harder to solve the communication and culture problems. You can lead by doing, and make sure your personal communication aligns with DevOps objectives, getting feedback, incorporating feedback, making sure there's continuous improvement in communication going on. But it is definitely more difficult. If you find yourself in that situation, talking to your manager or something can definitely help as well. But if you're in a management position, then talking to your engineers and emphasizing the importance of good communication and a communication feedback and improvement culture is super important. And it's hard to be really objective with this, whether you're in management or an engineer or whatever it is. Objectivity in this space is really difficult because you're in the day to day, and quite often it seems like what you're doing is what needs to be done. But it really helps to kind of try to take a step back. Maybe you dedicate some time on a weekly basis to really thinking about and dealing with this. Or something that I found that helps is kind of logging your communication for a day, going back over it and thinking about the ways that you could have improved those communications throughout your day. Sometimes after you've actually gotten through a scenario, it's easier to go back and look at what you could have improved versus trying to anticipate it in advance. So I'm a big fan of sort of thinking about how you're communicating on a day-to-day basis and then going back and looking at how you can improve that, versus trying to sort of make sure everything's perfect in the beginning. But that's the second part of getting over the DevOps speed bump. It's a little bit harder to quantify. This is where I find for clients sometimes getting an outside perspective on their communication and their culture can help a lot. So that's something you may consider is, bringing someone in who specializes in kind of identifying the issues and with culture and communication within an organization, and someone that's able to then lay those out in a coherent manner and help develop a plan for improving them. So let's move on to the more interesting part of the speed bump, which is trying to actually prevent it in the first place. The two main things that I see that cause the speed bump is the issue that I mentioned earlier of kind of rolling out automation and treating it like it's finished rather than treating it like a process that needs to be improved. And then the other one is similar, but related to process and communication and culture, where processes are rolled out and then they're left exactly as they were with no feedback and no continuous improvement across the organization. So dealing with the first one, treating automation like development, you should have pipelines in place for all of your automation. So whether that's cloud automation with infrastructure like tools like Terraform, whether that's CI/CD pipelines with Jenkins or Circle CI or AWS code build or GitLab pipelines or GitHub Actions or whatever it is, make sure it's checked in, treat it like code, and continuously develop it. There shouldn't be, when you're dealing with these kind of things, similar to how you would roll out a feature in software and then you would have bugs that you would work on with it or improvements that you want to make to it. Automation should be treated the same way. Treat your deployment pipelines, your build processes, your infrastructure automation as if they're an application. Improve them, budget the time to do that. Don't just create it, roll it out, and then leave it to stagnate. That's not how any of this really works in the real world. The real world changes all the time, and our automation and processes need to be treated the same way. Particularly when it comes to process, I find that this becomes a real issue in some companies where process gets documented or it becomes just kind of the unofficial standard for something. And then there's no improvement that's able to make its way into that process after that. So really thinking consciously about your process as you're rolling them out, as you're going through a DevOps transformation, making sure that you're thinking about that process and then looking at improvements to it, and really kind of if it helps, you can even list out your processes on paper or in a document or something, just at a high level. Just name the different processes you have going on in your organization, the different parts of the automation that go into them, and then do a review of your processes on a weekly or a monthly basis, and talk about with your team what's working, what's not working with those processes, and how they can be improved. If you do that and you get that feedback loop going into your processes, where you roll out a process and then you talk about it a week later, see what's actually working with it and what's not working, and then roll out improvements to the process, talk about it again in a week, you're way ahead of the game for most companies. And in my experience, if you do these two things, you iterate on your development and automation, and then you iterate on your processes like this, you'll actually prevent ever hitting the DevOps speed bump in the first place. What this will mean is that you may arrive at the destination slightly later. It can take a little bit longer to roll out automation when you're really thinking about feedback loops and rolling it out slowly and treating it like more like application development. It can take a little bit longer to actually get there because there's more involved in really doing really good automation that takes into account all of the caveats and nuances of the real world. But if you do it, you'll prevent the slowdown and the excessive complexity that tends to develop after you roll out new automation processes within a company. Same goes for non-automation or non-software process and communication and culture. Something really effective that I've found with teams that I've led in the past is sort of a weekly coffee meeting in the COVID era. Maybe that's a Zoom meeting that's really informal, or a Slack channel where people can talk about process improvement or something like that, but a dedicated place where people know they can talk about what needs to be improved in process in a non-judgmental manner, in a collaborative learning and fixing manner. That tends to be where you really get that continuous improvement that compounds over time and benefits you the most. All right, I'm going to move to Q&A really quick here. And it looks like Alec is asking, what is your opinion of low-code development libraries? This is a good question. I don't have that much experience with low-code development libraries. What I've found in the past with my sort of limited experience with them is that it's difficult to really create a low-code solution that is flexible enough for real-world needs. So this could apply to different automation tools. There are tools like Terraform, for example, that are very, very flexible in the way they approach infrastructure development. And then there are other tools that are a little bit less flexible, a little bit more rigid. And generally, tools like Terraform that are more flexible see a lot more adoption because they meet all of the nuances of the real world. Same applies to low-code development tools that I've seen. And there's a bunch of new ones out there. Some of them may be better than others. Like I said, I haven't experienced a lot of them personally, but my experience with them has not been particularly positive just due to that sort of real world nuance scenario where you develop something and it meets like 80% or 90% of the needs of the company, but the other 10% still requires you to code up a custom solution, and it ends up being a lot harder than if you just wrote the whole thing in code. Coding languages and code has developed the way that it has over the years due to real world requirements. If there was a way to simplify it, somebody probably would have tried it already. So that's kind of my experience with low code tools. I'm sure some people use them in certain contexts very effectively. I don't have anything against them. If it's something that you want to try, I would say definitely go for it. See if it works for you. But again, incorporate feedback into the process. And if it's not working for you, figure out how to either improve it and make it work, or get a tool that does, or a coding language that works for you within your context. Any other questions? Go ahead and type them in there if you have any other questions. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Wanted to just thank everyone for their time today. If you want to get in touch, if you have any feedback, questions, anything else, you can hop on over to the startopsgroup.com or just email me at cfornari@startopsgroup.com. I'm always happy to field questions. Your feedback is definitely welcomed. This is the first time we've done this particular webinar, so we'll definitely be looking at refining and improving it and incorporating feedback into it. We do the same thing for communication and webinars as we do for our technical processes. So feedback is welcomed. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if I can help in any way. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. It looks like there aren't any other questions for the moment. Thanks to everyone for your time, and we will see you again sometime. And I just realized there are a couple of questions in the chat that didn't make it to the Q&A section. One from George, so I'm going to cover that really quickly here. So George is asking, any chance you could share the right tools when considering CI/CD with continuous testing? And then he mentions he had to step out. So I'm going to go ahead and answer this, and then I'll share the recording in the LinkedIn event, and probably this will go on our YouTube channel as well. So, yeah, when you're looking at tools for continuous testing with CI/CD, I think continuous testing is really a prerequisite for proper sort of CI/CD. You can get CI, continuous integration of software, without continuous testing, but you can't get to CD, continuous deployment, without continuous testing. Testing has to be a prerequisite to your deployment. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're deploying and whether it's actually working at any given time. So that's something to really think about when you're looking at CI/CD, making sure that your testing is in place already, because you're not going to get to CD without it. As far as the right tools to use, I'm a big fan of any of the unit frameworks, so JUnit for Java, NUnit for .NET. I don't know if there's a unit testing framework for JavaScript, but I'm sure there's something out there. Those are great for code level tests. And then if you work on any kind of web product, then Selenium is really the way to go. I'm a fan of a tool called BrowserStack. That's browserstack.com. And that basically allows you to test across a bunch of different device types and browsers, and you can run Selenium type tests within that context. And they actually have a device farm with like real phones of different models and things like that. And then you can run those across those different phones. You can run on Windows, on Mac, on Linux, with different browser types, different browser versions. So new versions of browsers, old versions of browsers, all that stuff is super important. So yeah, just to wrap up this question, George, as far as the right tools to use, consider Selenium for your integration, front-end testing, any of the unit testing frameworks for your code level testing. There are obviously other types of testing, but those are the two major ones. And then most CI/CD systems can hook into like a BrowserStack run. There are alternatives to BrowserStack as well that are out there. That's just the one I've used mostly. So, that's usually just a few commands. You set up a little test framework, make sure you can launch it with a couple simple commands, and then just run that as a step within your CI/CD. Make sure those tests are passing before you actually do your deployments. So that hopefully that's helpful if you're considering rolling out a CI/CD type solution. It is worth noting CI/CD is very similar to a lot of other automation tools and things like that. And so I'm going to reiterate my point earlier about iterating on it, getting a basic continuous integration setup going where your code is building every time there's a check-in, every time there's a change. That's the first step and is super important. And then looking at how you can get your tests running on every change and check-in. in a dedicated environment, or some kind of environment that incorporates those changes. That's the second step. And then once those two pieces are in place and your continuous integration, your continuous testing are going well, then you can look at your continuous deployment process. Quite often people reverse that. They set up CI and then CD, and then they try to add the test later. That is fine, and it works if you're just deploying to like a dev environment or something. It may be necessary to get up and going and get your developers quicker feedback. So don't hesitate to do that if it's needed. But you'll want to make sure before you start doing this in production that you do have that testing in place and that you have reasonable coverage across your testing. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks again, everyone, for the time. It's been a pleasure. As I mentioned, I will put this recording up on the LinkedIn event and probably on YouTube as well. If it goes on YouTube, I'll link to it in the LinkedIn event. So thanks everyone so much for the time, and don't hesitate to reach out if I can help in any way.